There's an old adage in writing that ideas are a dime a dozen. It's the writing that's hard. And while that's true, we shouldn't minimize the part that our ideas play in selling our books to agents, editors, and readers. Brainstorming is one of the most crucial skills to develop as a writer, not only because the muse doesn't always visit when we want them to, but because often our initial ideas, however good they might seem at first, need refinement. And that's why I'm dedicating this video to brainstorming. I want to talk about how we can take an initial idea and work it until we have something that really grabs. And not just so that you can sell the story to a publisher, but so that you, the author, are excited to write about it. Hi, I'm Beaulieu, and I'm a full-time fantasy and science fiction author. I've published a dozen novels, more than 20 short stories, and I really enjoy talking about the craft of writing, which is why I started this channel, A Novel Approach. A Novel Approach is dedicated to helping you reach your writing goals by sharing inspiration, technique, and insights into the craft and business of writing. It's hard-earned knowledge that I've gathered from my 20-plus years of experience in writing and publishing, and my goal is to pass as much of it as I can on to you to make your journey to publication easier. We'll jump into the main content in just one second, but before we do, I wanted to let you know that this video doesn't have a sponsor, but it is supported by those of you who get value out of these instructional videos. I'm adding new content all the time, so I hope you'll like, subscribe, and share, or even check out my books via my website, quillings.com. Thanks so much for your support. It's because of you that I can continue to make free videos just like this one. So let's dive in. I like to start each of my presentations on the origin. Where did they come from? Years ago, I had a talk with my agent about a new book that I was writing, and I was asking about whether or not I should send it out to an outside editor before we submitted the proposal. The reason being, I thought, that if I got the manuscript really polished, I might be able to command a better advance on the book. And my agent replied he didn't really think that that was a good investment of money. During the discussion, what he mentioned was that he had sold books that were maybe not the most polished, but they had great ideas and they were just easy to sell. And conversely, he had books that had just immaculate prose, just really well written, but that they didn't stand out enough, and so they were tougher to sell. And so I ended up realizing that books are sold on ideas. It's how agents sell to editors. It's how sales departments sell to booksellers. It's how marketing sells to readers. A corollary to this, I had written a Norse-inspired middle grade novel, and my agent doesn't really deal with middle grade, and so I was looking for another agent to handle that type of book. And I was dinged by one agent for the book having too many parallels to Harry Potter. I had 3 main characters, 1 girl, 2 boys, and I could see what they were talking about after I got that. In short, the book's characters, at least, didn't stand out enough. And it was only one impression. Other people might have thought differently, but I lost a chance at representation because the book didn't stand out enough. So what's the lesson here? It's that prose isn't everything, that the idea of the book is just as, or more important than the words. It not only helps you sell, it helps you write, because you get excited about that idea. Now, does that mean that you should ignore prose? No, that's not what I'm saying. But you must also pay attention to your ideas. I ran a podcast for a while, Speculative, along with Greg Wilson, and we asked a few guests, and I was asked a few times in different interviews, if I could go back in time, what would I tell my younger self? And for me, early on, I was pretty safe in my writing, too safe in my mind now that I look back. I wished I had pushed harder on the ideas, the characters, the world, the plot, etc. Just made things larger than they were, more interesting, more fun, more zany, more scary, what have you. Stories are about extraordinary people doing extraordinary things. And the advice I would give to my younger self was to be more extraordinary in different ways, to make that story stand out more. And that's largely what this presentation is about. So it's part inspiration, using the examples of big ideas that I'm going to go over to show you what's possible. And it's part technique, covering tips, tricks, and pitfalls, and hopefully to guide you in crafting your own big ideas. So to set the stage, we'll cover 15 examples of novels with big ideas. Now, these are fantasy and sci-fi novels, but the concepts apply to all different types of fiction. So I would encourage you, if you are a thriller writer, mystery, romance writer, I think these concepts will apply because you want those types of stories to stand out in some way as well. And so then we'll categorize them a little bit, the different types of big ideas, And then we'll talk about some prerequisites for generating your own big ideas, some tips for generating them, and then some pitfalls. So the first book is The City in the City by China Miéville. This is one of my favorite books of the new century. It is a police procedural set in two cities that share the same geographical space. The cities are Begel and Ulcoma. And the concept is that in order to reduce strife culturally between these two peoples of those cities, it's sort of an analog for Jerusalem with the Jewish and Islamic faiths. And the agreement is such that you can live in Begel and be on a Begel street, and you must see Begel people, you can hear Begel conversations. And Ulcoma may exist in that same place. So if you want to go to Ulcoma, you have to go to the center of the city and go through customs, and then you can go back to that same street that you were just in 30 minutes ago, and now you must see Ulcoma people. You can go to Ulcoma stores, you can interact with Ulcoma in ways that you couldn't while you were in Begel. And this is by common agreement, and people learn how to see and unsee, hear and unhear the correct cities. And it's also enforced. It is enforced by law, and there are strict punishments for people who break these conventions. And so what happens in the story is there's a murder mystery set in one of these cities, and it forces the detective to go between the cities. And so you get this really strong feeling of what it's like to live in these two places. And it's really a mind twist to go through. It's just a great, great story in general, but like a great experience as a reader to go through that. And so the big idea is not the police procedural, it's these two cities coexisting together. The next one is The Song of Ice and Fire, starting with A Game of Thrones. There's plenty of things that make this story great, but what stood out to me at the time when I first read it was Martin's ruthlessness towards the characters. Everyone was sort of used to the heroes in fantasy making it to the end and rising to the occasion and putting down the great evil in the world. But Martin has lots of shades of gray for his characters and was not afraid to kill the ones that you cared about most. And he's gone on record saying that it's because he wanted you to care about the ones who lived. And it absolutely worked. I definitely cared about Arya's and Jon's fates more than I would have if I hadn't seen their father get killed. The Darwin Elevator is a book by Jason Huff. It's a sci-fi story about an alien ship that arrives in Earth orbit and shoots down a space elevator in Darwin, Australia. And so the space elevator exists and humanity starts to use it. It creates ships or structures that can climb up that space elevator, and there are several stations built along it. And then a number of years later, the same aliens introduce a plague to the Earth. And it's kind of like a zombie plague, but not quite the same thing. It causes human emotions to be elevated to 11. So hatred and anger and jealousy get ramped up, and it causes people to become crazed and zombie-like. They just start fighting and devouring one another. And the only place left that's safe is in Darwin, and roughly about 10 miles outside of the space elevator. And so you can imagine the pressure cooker that happens. This is humanity's last hope, this area right around Darwin and these stations along the space elevator. And you can imagine the power shift. The people who control things are the people who live either centrally in Darwin or along the space elevator itself. And the poorer people, of course, are going to get pushed to the edges. And so this is a first contact sci-fi thriller meets zombie apocalypse story. It was a really cool mashup, very good story, highly recommended. The Magicians by Lev Grossman is what if Hogwarts was in upstate New York and Harry Potter was a hipster? That's basically the tagline. It's a story about disaffected new adults instead of young adults. Now, I want to note that Patrick Rothfuss's The Name of the Wind, The Kingkiller Chronicles, is similar in style, in makeup to this. All three books, Harry Potter, The Magicians, and The Kingkiller Chronicles, are about boys, young men, who go to a school of magic. They're basically a boy who learned better type of story. But each has its own unique take on that concept, that basic concept. The Chronicles of Amber by Roger Zelazny opens with a man who has amnesia. He's in the hospital, and he discovers very quickly that he is actually a prince in a portal realm. And he has a large family, and for some reason, his family is out to kill him. Maybe not all of them, he finds. He might have some allies, but he can't remember all of them. And so it's this really fun pulling back of the curtains on what happened to Corwin and the brothers and sisters that he meets and has to take care with, and even his allies he's not able to trust fully. Their father was murdered. There's now a race for ascension to the throne, and Corwin is part of that. And some people fear that he is going to be the king or want to be king. He doesn't even remember that that's a possibility in the beginning. So it was, again, at the time, a very unique entry into tales of high fantasy, sprawling tale with a large cast of characters, and Zelazny did a really good job of differentiating the cast from one another. Ancillary Justice by Anne Leckie is a story about the Roch Empire, which has expanded across the entire galaxy, partly because of its ancillaries. Ancillaries are humans who are assimilated into a hive mind of sorts and attached to a starship. So each of these starships has, I can't remember exactly, hundreds of different ancillaries that it controls. So it is an AI controlling humans. It's a very strong character-driven experience, seeing this sweeping tale through one of those ancillaries. And just to give you a sense of what it was like reading this, one of the most powerful scenes to me was when the ancillary, the main character, comes across as kind of a cipher. It's hard to feel her emotions as the story is unveiled. And the reason we find out is because she is an ancillary and her emotions are suppressed. Throughout the story, we wonder, how did she become an ancillary? What happened to her? And that's revealed in a scene at one point, and the main character reveals that in a very dry manner. She's very disconnected from the experience, and it makes it all the more horrifying as a reader because she doesn't care. We care for her as she's going through this process of being turned from a human into a slave tied to this ship. A very good book in general, but just really interesting from that aspect. The Stormlight Archive from Brandon Sanderson. Sweeping epic fantasy set in this storm-wracked world. I think it's planned as 10 books. I think 4 are out at this point as of the making of this video. Many points of view a la Game of Thrones, and the world figures into the story in many unique ways, driving different cultures that are in play, the geography and the story as a whole, making it a character in its own right. Wool by Hugh Howey is about a society trapped in this massive underground silo, and one man breaks their greatest taboo. He asks to go outside. There's this huge mystery about what happened to humanity. Why are people trapped in this silo? Why does nobody want anyone to know what really happened? And what really exists outside the silo? Nobody knows, but we find out as the story moves along. So just a really delicious trail of breadcrumbs that we get to follow to find out what happened. The Lies of Loch Lamora by Scott Lynch is Ocean's 11 meets a fantasy re-envisioning of medieval Venice. The characters are a band of misfits who worship the god of thieves. They're all kind of drawn in as orphans into this gang of thieves, and those thieves worship the god of thieves. And so their exploits are driven by their desire to please their god. And so it's not just for riches. They're kind of looking for fame. They're trying to create the biggest heist, the biggest theft that they can think of to honor their god. And so the capers they pull off are a form of worship. It's an irreverent group, especially Loch Lamora himself. It's a funny, touching, and dangerous tale. Just one of my favorite books of all time. The White Trash Zombies series from Diana Rowland is a zombie tale from a new perspective, basically sympathetic zombies. And it echoes the wave of vampire stories, portraying zombies as intriguing, tragic, sexy. It's an existing trope made new. Ready Player One is a sci-fi Matrix-style story with a heavy nostalgia component. It's a really fun romp through the 80s. The mystery that the egg hunters, the Gunters in this story have to solve are all kind of driven and revolve around stuff, video games, music from the 80s. Pop culture, basically. And me as a child of the 80s, it was just super duper fun to read a story that was tightly written. It's definitely a page turner, but the nostalgia factor was just huge for me as well. Just a really fun story. The Coldfire trilogy, starting with Black Sun Rising from C.S. Friedman, one of my favorite trilogies of all time. It's about a generation ship, so nominally sci-fi, and it's traveling to this distant world, and there's some kind of emergency that happens partway there. And they're forced to reroute to the closest planet they can, and they get there, they arrive, and when they do, they find that this planet has kind of a Gaia effect. The planet is aware and living, and it has reached equilibrium with its inhabitants, the plants and animals that live on it. But when man is introduced and they start creating a society from the people who crash landed on this planet, they start to invoke their fears from Earth, and the new world gives life to them. So the world creates vampires and werewolves to sort of feast on humanity, that society that's living there, as if they were a cancer that needs to be destroyed. I think it's centuries later, when the story actually opens, we know none of that. It starts as a fantasy. Some of the characters are magic users, and we meet one of the most dastardly magic users that you see on the cover. He becomes one of the heroes, and we slowly start to see what happened in the distant past, how they arrived on a spaceship, and what happened to the world. So it's just a really cool mashup of fantasy with sci-fi underpinnings. World War Z from Max Brooks, An Oral History of the Zombie War. So in the aftermath of a zombie apocalypse, people are interviewed, slowly revealing the larger tale. So this is a mosaic-style story that details the apocalypse. And so this has some shades of Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire. The Heroes by Joe Abercrombie is about a group of mercenaries who are asked to defend a pivotal position topped by a henge known as the Heroes. It's a bloody battle spanning the course of 3 days. It's notable for Abercrombie's tight, witty prose and his gallows humor, but it's interesting because it's a World War II siege movie re-envisioned as a fantasy. Kings of the Wild from Nicholas Eames is about Clay Cooper, who used to be part of a band. The band was a group of adventurers, but you quickly see that there are tons of parallels to like 70s heavy metal and rock bands. And so one of his ex-bandmates comes and he says his daughter has been captured and is trapped in this besieged city in the wild. He's asking that they get the band back together, and he has to get Clay first, so the rest of them will agree, and they're all going to journey across the wild to save Rose. And so the band reunites for one last tour across the wild. It's a get the band back together story, recast as this fantasy adventure. So it's got these really strong 70s rock overtones, but also like D&D style dungeon crawls. For someone like me who sort of likes both of those things, it was just a really fun mashup, a really fun story. I love that one of the characters has an axe, right? So he's like the bass player, and one guy is like a bard style character, and so they make fun of him as D&D members do to their bards. Just, yeah, really fun story. Okay, so those were our 15. Let's take a step back and talk about the different types of ideas that we might be able to generate for our stories. I think we can break them down into 5 different groups: the world, the characters, the speculative elements, the situation that they're in, and finally the style. And so I'm going to go through and break down what we just covered into these different types. So first up is the world, big idea type number 1. So I think Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archive fits into this one. The world itself, a fantastical storm-wracked world, is the bedrock for this epic fantasy tale. He's pushing hard, and this is not to say he's not pushing hard in other areas. I'm just saying that this kind of fits this type of big idea, and you can use that as inspiration for yours. Are there things in your world where you can push harder and make them bigger and more interesting and affect more things, both with the story and the characters who inhabit them? C.S. Friedman's Cold-Fire trilogy, the world itself, when that generation ship arrived on the planet, was at balance, and then mankind showed up and screwed it all up. That reveal just blew me away at the time, just living in this fantasy world and then finding, oh my god, they're actually, like from Earth, and they arrived on this world and caused everything to want to get rid of them again, like they were a cancer or something. It's the city in the city. Just a brilliant idea for 2 unique cities that coexist spatially but not culturally. Big idea type number 2, the characters. So Anne Leckie's Ancillary Justice. This is partly the spec-fic elements as well, the ancillaries. I think that was a really cool concept. But without the main character, we wouldn't care nearly as much. And so I think this is pretty character-driven, and being able to live that experience through the main character and what they went through, caring for her, was a very interesting thing to read through. George Martin's The Song of Ice and Fire. It's a little bit hard to classify this one. It isn't very different from a lot of gritty, dark fantasies that preceded it, but he did push the element of being willing to kill characters and making you care about the ones who survived more. Lev Grossman's The Magicians. a school for magic in the modern world populated by hip young adults who haven't yet found their place in it. Again, at the time, it was just an interesting take. The new adult genre was coming around at the time that he wrote this. And I actually interviewed Lev for the podcast that I mentioned, Speculate. And he talked about himself being disaffected when he finished college. He didn't quite know his place in the world. He didn't quite know what he wanted to do. He channeled a lot of that into the magicians. So just, a cool take on the School of Magic, the Boy Who Learned Better story. Roger Zelazny's The Chronicles of Amber. Again, a little bit tough to figure out where to put this one, but the characters are what made this stand out to me. Just a very interesting cast, and putting Corwin in this place where he didn't know who to trust and he had to find out along the way. Big idea type number 3, the speculative elements. So Diana Rowland's The White Trash Zombie series, it's a twist on an old trope, but a very compelling one. So maybe you can do something with that with yours. Jason Huff's The Darwin Elevator. The combination of an alien race introducing something beneficial like the space elevator, and then turning around and introducing a plague is unique and intriguing. And as you go through the book, there are more hints that other events are coming from that alien race. I think they're called the Builders. I can't remember for sure. But the number of years between events is shrinking. And so in the semi-distant past, the elevator arrived. Nearer, the plague was introduced. And then I think they see a ship that's coming to Earth, and they don't know what it's going to do, or if there are going to be builders on them, or what. So just very cool pressure cooker and unique set of ideas in one story. Big idea type number 4, The Situation. Joe Abercrombie's The Heroes. Again, this is a 3-day siege, a World War II siege movie. Becomes the backdrop for the tale, heightening tensions along the way. Just a very gritty, bloody, muddy story. Jason Huff's The Darwin Elevator. I thought this fit here as well because of the pressure cooker that Darwin, Australia becomes after the builders introduce the elevator and then make it so that the plague doesn't affect anybody inside of that place. And so what happens is the main characters are this crew who run a dropship. That ship is pulled up along the space elevator, and then it drops and glides as far as it can to conserve fuel, picks up supplies, medicine, technology, what have you, and then comes back to Darwin. That's how the story is introduced. It's just a really well-conceived story in terms of ratcheting up the tension. Hugh Howey's Wool, the last bastion of humanity, has trapped themselves in underground silos, and almost no one remembers why. Very cool way to start a story. Scott Lynch's The Lies of Locke Lamora, a group of misfits who pull off grand capers to honor the god of thieves. It's just really delicious reading. And then big idea type number 5, the style. Max Brooks's World War Z, this collection of stories about the survivors of a zombie apocalypse, is a really compelling way to approach a book. We get this mosaic of what happened on Earth from different points of view. Again, not terribly different from Interview with a Vampire, an existing idea made new. Ernest Cline's Ready Player One. The big draw to this and the big idea was straight up nostalgia for the 80s. It was just jam-packed with trivia and references to music, games, pop culture from the 80s. Just made it really fun reading, along with it being fast-paced and having a tight plot. Nicholas Eames' Kings of the Wild, another nostalgia book, this time with a band of characters who return for one last tour. It's a mashup of old D&D adventures and the life of rock bands / rock stars. One quick reality check. Do these types really matter? In the end, no. Your agent is not going to know what you're talking about if you mention them. Neither is your editor. I just created these so we had some different things to talk about and ways to look at how you could approach your story and your big ideas. They're a good place to start. Play with the ideas in each of these arenas to see what you come up with. And sometimes, remember, the combination of two unique elements leads to a big idea that makes the story stand out. C.S. Friedman's Coldfire trilogy, having that science fictional underpinnings to a fantasy story was just really cool. It made it stand out. If it didn't have the science fictional element, it would have been like so many other high fantasy stories of the time. But having that science fictional background made it stand out and just made it really fun and interesting to see what happened. What made this world turn into this magic-using place. So some prerequisites for generating your big idea. First of all, be well-versed in your primary genre. We are told to read widely, read outside of your genre, and that is good advice, and you should do it. But you should also be reading in your primary genre as well. You have to know what's been done before, and so able to tell a fresh idea from a cliched one. You should also be analyzing the breakout novels from the past 5 years because agents and editors are certainly doing that, as are the committees within publishers that now decide books. Gone are the days where editors are going to decide if they're going to publish a book or not. It's not up to an individual editor anymore. It goes to a committee where the sales department, marketing, editorial all convene and decide which of the books that the editors want to buy will actually buy them. And so having something that stands out for them to present during that committee meeting is just a huge leg up for your story. By analyzing the breakout novels, again, from roughly the past 5 years, you can see what's been done. And so what might they be looking for to some degree? And again, I'm not suggesting you try to copy some successful story. I'm saying those might give you inspiration. You'll know what ground has been tread, and you'll know where you can go to set yourself apart. That's the idea here. This next one, analyzing novels that fail to sell, is tougher. You have your own novels. If you have written some novels that didn't sell, I would recommend that you go back, and certainly we all go through a progression, right? The writing itself may not have been up to snuff. That was certainly true of my early novels, but they may have failed in the ideas as well. They may have been too run-of-the-mill, okay? And so you owe it to yourself to go back and look at those and determine if that was true. Could you have pushed yourself harder in some areas or not? Also, talk to other writers. We often join writing groups, talk to some folks, ask them about the novels that they fail to sell, and talk about the big ideas. Just be honest about what you're looking for and see if you can get some ideas of maybe why theirs didn't sell. And together you can start getting a sense of how you can make your next stories, your future stories, better and more attractive to agents, editors, and in the end, readers. Okay, so some tips for big idea creation. You really have to become a marketing exec. Pretend that you're pitching your book to a book buyer and you have 10 seconds to do so. You have to boil your pitch down to the thing that makes the book stand out the most, right? Differentiate it from the, let's face it, very competitive world out there. I often say that what readers in the end, and so agents and editors are looking for, is something like something they've read before, only different. And that's what I try to boil my pitch down to. Give them something so they know what it's like, but then tell them how it's different. If you can do that, that will get them to say, oh, okay, well, tell me more. And then you're in. You start expanding on that from there. I also highly recommend looking at Randy Ingermanson's snowflake plotting method. You can just Google search that exact phrase. It's a blog post from years ago, but it's very insightful, and I've used it myself many times. The basic idea is that you boil your story down into a single sentence. What is this story about? And then from there, you generate a paragraph of 3 to 5 sentences. In other words, you expand on that one sentence. So now you have a paragraph of 3 to 5 sentences. You take each of those sentences and they each become their own paragraph. So now you have 3 to 5 paragraphs. That's roughly a page. That's a good teaser for what your story is about and might be used, parts of it anyway, in your query letter. And then you take each paragraph, 3 to 5 paragraphs, and make them each a page. And so now you have a decent outline for your story. Just going back, the basic idea is that you're taking the kernel of your story, the story in its distilled essence, and you're kind of expanding from there. And so everything is flowing from that. And so you want to have a really unique idea, and you want to keep pushing yourself until you have something like that, something that really gives you drive, that you really feel that you want to write about. And that will really help drive everything else that comes from it. And it helps you in your querying, editing process. It helps your agent/editor sell either internally or to a publisher, perhaps. It just helps all the way down the line. So take a look at that and see if that helps you at all, and give it a try a couple of times. I often say in writing, don't be afraid to try new things. So give it a try, but also do keep in mind that not everything works for everybody. And so one of the things that we're doing in writing is collecting tools that work for us. And we can only know which ones work if we try them out a little bit. And we slowly collect tools in our writing toolbox that work for us over time until we become more and more capable. You can also, as we've shown already, combine genres in unexpected ways. So Scott Lynch's The Lies of Locke Lamora, a heist story a la Ocean's 11 meets Renaissance Venice. Just a cool twist. Joe Abercrombie's The Heroes, World War II siege movie meets heroic fantasy. Really cool setup for a story. Also, don't settle. Trust your instincts when you're generating these ideas. Does it feel unique to you or not? Does it give you juice? If not, keep digging. When you're listening to other people talk about their stories or you hear ideas about new movies, you'll occasionally go, oh, wow. You have this kind of head jerk moment and you're like, wow, that's a really cool idea. I wish I had that first, right? That's the kind of thing that you're looking for your story. And if you don't feel that, I don't think there's much point in going on until you can find something like that. You have to keep pushing. And it's very common for us to have multiple ideas, and maybe you have to set that one aside for a little bit and just work on something else. If you're in the idea generation stage, we're not really talking about the writing process itself, but rather the idea generation for what you want to write next. And so just keep pushing yourself, wait for that head jerk moment, and then glom onto that, expand on it. It may not always work out. It may actually turn out to be fool's gold, but that head jerk moment is often a good indicator that you're onto something. So just wait for that, keep pushing till you get it, and then expand on it from there. You can also take an idea that is currently playing a small role in your story and blow it up. So instead of a small effect, make it affect the world, whatever that means to your story. Maybe it's only in one city or something like that. Maybe it's a neighborhood, maybe it's a single house, or maybe it's across galaxies, who knows. Or you can make a big idea smaller and see what happens. Sometimes putting constraints on things really helps generate interest in the story. So make something affect fewer people or only one character. Maybe one person has a unique power and ability, not everybody. You can give characters more control or less control. So maybe the prince that you have who was very powerful really ought to be a pauper. Or maybe the kid running the streets should inherit fortune from the family he didn't know he had and has a company to control suddenly. See what you can do with scope of magic, of characters, and the power that they command, and see what happens. You can set up a house of cards that's ready to topple. In the Darwin elevator, Earth is on the brink of complete collapse, but the elevator still exists, giving some hope. Could you create something like that for your world? Is something about to happen and the characters have the ability to make it happen or stop it from happening? You can set up an interesting status quo or an interesting way to tear it down. Keeping in mind the status quo could be dystopic or utopic. Brandon Sanderson's Elantris, we didn't talk about this earlier, but it's a utopia of sorts that is brought down when these godlike powers are stripped from its citizens, and they're forced into this ghetto type of area. That's where the story begins. You can look for old ideas that you can make fresh again. A good place to look are some of your influences. Be sure, though, that you're not just rehashing the past. You need to bring a unique vision to the story. Look for a trend that you'd like to break. When I initially made this presentation, grimdark was pretty popular, so that's where this comes from, but whatever is popular, is there something that you could go against the grain with? Naomi Novik came out with Uprooted, and it was a fairy tale retelling of these old Eastern European, Russian, Germanic tales, and it was, she's a brilliant writer to begin with, so anything she writes is awesome, but this was just something that I thought went against the grain a bit and stood out because of it. Some of the pitfalls that you can run into is just because an idea is different doesn't make it interesting necessarily. Reusing some old ideas can feel like the same old, same old. Trying to go against the grain can be dangerous. Editors are looking for things that are selling well, but also they want to find something fresh. Again, like something else, only different. So is your book that, or is it chasing a market that isn't really there? And that's a pretty tough one to determine, honestly. Let the idea sit for a little bit. Hopefully you have idea journals. You jot down ideas for parts of stories, stories on their own, full novels, what have you, and you put them in some kind of document, doesn't matter where. And you come back to them every now and then, and maybe you take a couple of those ideas and mash them together to come up with something new for a twist on an existing story that you're writing or a brand new story on its own. You probably should take some of these ideas and just let them sit for a while. Sometimes the ideas that we have, when we look at them a few days, a few weeks, a few months later, aren't really all that interesting. So let it sit for a while and then come back to it and see what you think. Also, do share with other writers and just get their take on it and try to get an honest take, try to get with people who are going to judge that honestly for you so that you can evaluate it. Obviously, if you have an agent or an editor, you'll run this stuff by them as well and see what they think. So now it's your turn. Think of big ideas from books that you've read, analyze your own reading history, and look at some of the stuff that really stands out to you in terms of the ideas. See if you can find one or two of each type. The world, how is that interesting or unique in these stories that you're looking at? The characters, the speculative elements, the situation, and the style. In your own projects, again, look back on what you've written in the past. Have you pushed your ideas hard enough? Can you think of new ideas you might pursue for a new project? Perhaps even based on your old ones that didn't quite pan out. Maybe they needed to be changed somehow. Did some of your old projects fall short in terms of big ideas? And can you learn any lessons from those? Analyze what you've written. Talk to other writers as well and see if you can share that information too. Wrapping up, the big idea, I would contend, is just as important as your execution. Generating your big idea helps in many ways. It provides drive to write the novel, first and foremost. It helps you sell it to an agent or an editor. It helps your agent sell it to a publisher. It will get people talking about it. That ever-elusive buzz that we're looking for as writers is helped greatly by having a big idea, a good big idea. So work on your big idea early. Don't stop working on that idea just because you're writing. You may come up with some new twist along the way, and absolutely pay attention to that stuff. That is your hindbrain working for you, and it's a gift. So latch onto that stuff. It may not always work again. Some of those things that I come up with midstream while writing a story, I think is going to work at first, and then I have to abandon it. But don't just throw it away either just because you've started the story. Think about it, see if it'll work. If it does, use it. If not, move on. Don't be afraid to change course if something comes to you midstream. Better to get it done now than to have a broken story in the end. Trust your instincts, and if you feel like the story merits a change because of the cool new idea that you just thought up, then use it. If you become lost, this is yet another benefit of having the big idea. You are full of excitement when you first come up with that idea, and you generate a lot of things that flow from that early on. If you get lost, sometimes it's beneficial to go back and just kind of think about where did things start? And maybe you're a little bit astray, you're a little bit lost on where things should go in your story. And you can use the big idea to get you back on track. Just kind of live in that mental space again for a while and see if that helps you out. And then use it as a touchstone to help drive you forward. Again, try to hold and maintain that excitement in you as you write, and that'll help pull you forward through the story until you get to the end. That was a fair bit of information to digest all at once, and I've always found that we can't digest new concepts in one sitting. It takes time, thought, practice, and reflection. And because of that, I'd urge you to come back to this video to really cement the ideas that are presented here. But now I'd like to turn it over to you. What are some of the best story ideas you've come across in novels? Do you have ways of developing or refining your ideas that weren't mentioned here? If so, please leave a comment below. Other writers will appreciate it. I certainly will. We're all trying to continue to learn the craft of writing, and all this kind of thing just helps. So please share. And if you found it useful, please like and share with those who might find it useful themselves. As I mentioned earlier, I'll have more mastering fiction videos. This is just number 1 of the planned 8 or 9 so far. I have a couple of Scrivener videos already, and then I'm going to have more of those, including Compile, how to use Compile, and the outline and corkboard views to start with. So hit subscribe to be notified when those come out. Until next time, everyone, dream big, stay positive, and keep writing. Peace, everyone.